Reading this morning is from 2 Samuel chapter 9, David and Mephibosheth. David asked, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. The king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet." "Where is he?" the king asked. Ziba answered, "He is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar." So King David had him brought before him from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel. When Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, "Mephibosheth?" "At your service," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's steward, and said to him, "I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Mephibosheth, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "Your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do." So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son called Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. He was lame in both feet. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Alison. That's not an easy reading because you have to say Mephibosheth several times. You got it right pretty much all the time. I hope I do the same. Morning, I'm Emma Hayward. I'm a member here at Holy Trinity, and it's my pleasure to be able to speak to you this morning on the topic of kindness. My last sermon here was a few months ago, and it was from the book of James, and like most of the book of James, it was really hard to write and hard to preach and hard to hear. So I was really happy to be given the nice cuddly topic of kindness this time round. God is kind. I hope you know that. Maybe you've got reason to doubt his kindness, or perhaps you've never actually experienced the kindness of God. But kindness is central to the character of God. So as we look at the topic of kindness, we're really looking at how we, imperfect people, can imitate our kind and loving Father, a good and kind Father who invites his enemies to become his children, who made himself vulnerable to the point of death on a cross, and whose kindness who changes the people who follow him and the people who those people touch. I'm going to tell you several stories of kindness, but they all point back to him. Now, if you happen to be researching a sermon on kindness, you don't have to look very far to find a few good quotes. They seem to be all over the internet. So here's a couple. "Kindness is spreading sunshine into people's lives, no matter what the weather. In a world where you can be anything, be kind." I actually quite like that one. I sometimes think that we're so busy being politically correct that we forget to be kind. So one of the first questions I asked myself when I was preparing this sermon was, well, what is it that the Bible has got to say about kindness that isn't already on a motivational poster or pinned to a school notice board or printed on a t-shirt? So that's what today's sermon's really going to be about. It's going to be about the difference between everyday kindness and then the sort of kindness that David showed to Mephibosheth. There is a bit of a backstory to today's passage, which will probably be quite helpful to know. So David wasn't always a king. He started off as a shepherd, and he was anointed or chosen to be king while King Saul was still on the throne. It's fair to say that this caused quite a degree of tension. David became Saul's servant, but he had to endure years of uncertainty as Saul alternately welcomed him and threatened to kill him. Through this time, David became close friends with Saul's son, Jonathan. And during one episode, when King Saul was in a bit of a rage, David asked Jonathan to show him kindness by warning him if King Saul was going to try to kill him again. Jonathan agrees, but in return, he asked David to show him and his descendants kindness in return. The two men make a promise to each other on this basis, and it's that promise that David is calling to mind years later when he sits on the throne and starts wondering if there's any member of Saul and Jonathan's family left to whom he can show this kindness. The word used for kindness in this story is hesed. Hesed means to be kind or merciful, but it's more than your everyday holding the door open for somebody sort of kindness. It's much deeper than that. Hesed is kindness of the quality usually reserved only for your family and really close friends. And this is where the Bible and the internet memes completely part company. I'm going to explore with you three key differences between ordinary everyday kindness and hesed kindness. So the three things are this: that hesed is not a random act of kindness, but a deliberate step to treat someone as family. Demonstrating hesed can be costly. It can involve overcoming our fear and putting ourselves in a vulnerable position. And hesed is there to establish and build relationships and has the power to change lives. So, firstly, as I speak to you about kindness being a deliberate decision to treat someone as family, I want to show you a picture of two people I can guarantee you've never heard of. But they demonstrated amazing kindness. I've often imagined showing their picture here on the screen at Holy Trinity because theirs is a story that I want to share. This is Brian and Joyce Towles. I met Brian and Joyce when I was travelling in New Zealand. I took a year out before I came here to medical school. I was just 18. I'd pitched my tent in Nelson, a town in South Island. And I turned up to St. Stephen's Church in time for the evening service. Brian and Joyce welcomed me at the door, found out who I was, and by the end of the evening had invited me to go and stay in their home. Brian came and collected me in the tent the next morning in his car. Brian and Joyce had never been able to have children of their own, but for the next few days, it was as if I was one of their grandchildren. I stayed around in that area for a few weeks and stayed with them intermittently during this time. And when it was time for me to move on, we kept in touch and wrote to each other for many years. And for all those years, they prayed for me every Friday. Joyce died quite a number of years ago, and Brian's letters got written in an ever more shaky hand until they stopped completely. And I can only imagine that because he'd reached his 90s, he'd been called home to heaven. But friends, I can't put into words the impact that this faithful, prayerful, and kind couple have had on my life. I have been literally, truly blessed by them. If I've had any success in life, the blessings of faith and of family, if you've received anything from me as I've ministered here at Holy Trinity, you've been blessed by them too. Their prayers over all those years have made a difference. They were just an ordinary retired couple, deliberately and persistently demonstrating the kindness of God. Brian and Joyce did for me what David did for Mephibosheth. David made a decision to welcome him, to provide for him, and to make him one of the family, sitting at the table like one of his own sons. My second point is that showing this sort of Hesed kindness can be costly. It can mean overcoming our own fear and putting ourselves in a vulnerable position. When David was king, it was normal for a new monarch, if they hadn't inherited the throne, to kind of put to death everybody who was associated with the previous monarch. Now, why did they do that? Well, it was because of fear, wasn't it? Fear that some nephew or cousin or some long-lost relative would one day stake a claim to the throne and gather a following and stage a coup. Now, Jonathan had anticipated this. He knew that his father, King Saul's days were numbered. So he made David promise that he would show kindness to his family. The promise was made secretly, which is probably why Mephibosheth hadn't made himself known, but had actually found shelter in an out-of-the-way place, hoping to escape notice. He was hiding with somebody who I think is one of the Bible's hidden heroes. You find them sometimes, just a little bit of scripture, but, they're hiding away. They haven't made sort of big Bible headlines. Machir, son of Amiel. Machir presumably knew that if David was like most other monarchs, he'd be looking for members of the ex-royal household to execute them. To offer Mephibosheth assistance was to put himself in harm's way. It may have been financially costly too. Remember, Mephibosheth was crippled in his feet, and he hadn't got any property at this stage. So he would have been financially dependent on Machir. But despite the cost and the potential danger, Machir still looked after Mephibosheth in his own home until David took him to live in Jerusalem. That's why I think Machir is one of the Bible's hidden heroes. My friend Vic Jacobson is also a hero to me. I'll put up the next slide to show you his picture. Vic is willing to show kindness, even if this means putting himself in a vulnerable position. Vic knows about being vulnerable because he grew up in children's homes, and he actually became a Christian in Winchester Prison. He later became a Baptist minister, a preacher, and an evangelist. Before he began a ministry among orphans and prisoners in Ukraine, which is where I met him, he'd spent time ministering in the traveling community, and once even managed to get himself banned from the Glastonbury Festival for the terrible crime of baptizing people in a cattle trough. He thinks he's the only person who holds this record for being actually banned. Now, Vic has just turned 80, and a few years ago he shared a story on Facebook which really struck me. Vic was woken in the early hours of the morning by his outdoor security light coming on. Then he could hear noises as if somebody was trying to break into his house. Now, Vic is brave, but he's not stupid, so he did call the police and they promised that they would attend. Now, Vic told me that the next thing he heard was somebody vomiting in his porch. And he said, well, I realized that whoever was outside was drunk, and I know how to deal with drunks. So Vic opened the door, told the man that if he was going to be sick, he should come in and use the downstairs loo, and then Vic went and put the kettle on. Once the would-be intruder had finished doing what he needed to do, Vic gave him coffee and shared the gospel. A couple of hours later, Vic had an early appointment, so he suggested that, seeing as his bed was now empty, the man could use it to sleep off the rest of his intoxication until he got back. Now, how would you have reacted in a situation like that? I don't think I would have done what Vic did, but Vic refused to allow fear to govern his actions. He not only shared the gospel, but he showed the gospel. He treated this man with kindness that he did not deserve. In some countries where firearms are more commonly held by citizens, I can well imagine the outcome would have been completely different. But what sort of society would we prefer to live in, really? One governed by fear, or one given over to kindness? Fear has a powerful hold over us, but when we act out of fear for ourselves, the outcome for others is rarely positive. And what would have happened to Mephibosheth if Machir and then David had acted out of fear and not shown him kindness? When Jesus knew that he was going to be arrested and sentenced to death, he asked God if there was another way. He felt the same as any human would when they knew they were going to undergo crucifixion. But then he prayed, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." He put his fear to one side and chose the path of love, making it possible for his enemies to become his children. And that leads on to the third point. Hesed kindness changes lives. If someone holds a door open for me or brings me a cup of tea in bed, it definitely makes me smile. It lifts my day. Those small acts of kindness really make a difference, so let's do lots of them. But they are not life-changing, so let's not stop there. David could have shown Mephibosheth a kind of an arm's length sort of kindness. He could have given his land back to him or paid him an allowance and left it at that. But he didn't, because he had promised Jonathan that he would show hesed kindness, the kindness that treats people as if they are family. So what did that mean for Mephibosheth? He was living in the shadows with no income and no means of earning due to his disability. He was dependent on Machir. But then David decided to show him kindness, and he was fully, completely restored. He gets not just financial security, but he gets a welcome and dignity and community. A seat at the king's table for the rest of his life. Can you imagine the difference that that made to the man? Hesed kindness changes lives as it welcomes people into the family. I mentioned Vic's work in Ukraine earlier. And one of the things his charity does is to find foster homes and adoptive parents for children who live in state institutions. The medical director documented something extraordinary about these children. Often the children in the institutions were quite small for their age, and poor nutrition probably had something to do with that. But the doctor in charge noticed that they often had a growth spurt, not when their diet changed, but when they were told that they were going to go and live with a family. The growing started before they even moved. That's the power of love and kindness. You may have heard about Safe Families, which is on the next slide. Safe Families is a charity that works locally that's really understood how simple acts of kindness can make a real difference. What Safe Families does is it pairs up families who need a bit of support with families like yours and mine who can lend a hand, just like we would lend a hand if it was a family member or somebody we knew from church or a close friend. On their website you can hear Tam's story. Tam is a single mum whose own parents died when she was quite young, and she's got children of her own now. She gets support from volunteers who help just by taking the kids out for a couple of hours so that she can get a bit of headspace, or doing things like helping her put up shelves, doing things around the house. And she says on the video, "It makes me feel like I have a family, an auntie or an uncle or a mum and a dad." The volunteers do change your life. When you're in a bad place, they make it positive. Hesed kindness does change lives, it really does. In areas where Safe Families work, it reduces referrals to foster care by 10%. So there we have it. Hesed kindness is so much more than spreading a little sunshine into people's lives. It's a deliberate act, a decision to treat someone as if they're family. It might involve overcoming our own fear and putting ourselves in a vulnerable position. But this is how we imitate Jesus. He's only asking us to walk the path that he's walked before us. So I'm asking you this morning to consider, well, how can you do this? How can you be like Machir or David, Brian and Joyce, or Vic? These people all have the same guide and inspiration, God himself. If you're here today and you haven't yet experienced the kindness of God for yourself, then there's an opportunity for that now. God loves you so much that he sent his son into the world to die in your place so that you can be made one of the family and have your life changed forever. And if you have experienced the kindness of God for yourself, pass it on.